Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Coffee Shop Philosophy. As always, I'm your host, Killian, managing editor for the literature and publication section of Being Libertarian, LLC, which includes beinglibertarian.com, think-liberty.com, rationalstandard.com, and our publication arm, Champion Books, which does have its inaugural book out, as I've mentioned in several episodes so far, Igniting Freedom, Voices for Liberty Around the World. Definitely a great read if you haven't. You can follow us on all forms of social media. You can listen to our podcast wherever you get your podcasts. You can follow me directly on Facebook by searching Killian Hobbs Author. And with all that said and done, we're going to roll right into the episode. We're continuing our series talking about specific thinkers. So different philosophers, economists, so on and so forth. Today I'm actually joined by one Andrew Kern. Andrew, say hello to everybody there.
Hey, how's everybody doing?
Hopefully they're doing well. Obviously, this is a recording, so they're not going to really be able to respond, sadly. But like I said before, you can respond just by sending messages to the author page here, or actually by reaching out to the Principled Libertarian. For those of you that haven't come across that page, Andrew Kern's one of the brilliant minds behind that, and some of the purest libertarian messaging and presentation of ideas that you'll find out there. It definitely earns the title Principled in its name, with some of the things that it posts and the way that it holds steadfast to those things, especially when they engage with people in their commentary sections or even in their Facebook group for the fans. So since I actually have the chance to talk to you in person, or at least through voice at this time, I do want to say that you do amazing work over there, Andrew. Definitely amazing stuff as far as libertarianism is concerned.
Thank you very much. Yeah, we try not to be too purist, despite the name, but yeah, we try to keep consistently, anti-state and pro-market.
You're actually you and our own Vinnie Marshall, and I think I've started to take on adapting the term, going with market anarchist rather than ANCAP, just considering some of the key differences in the range of thought that's involved in that. And a lot of that's actually come out of talks with you or just seeing different arguments that's presented through your page. So great stuff there. Rolling into the episode today, the person that we're discussing, the person we're going to be diving into is David Friedman. So for those of you that don't know, David Friedman is the son of the economists Rose and Milton Friedman. Hopefully you have heard of Milton Friedman before, and I'm hoping to do a episode on his work as well. But we're going to start off here with David Friedman, just because some of the stuff that he's presented is very unique, as well as it takes a very, I want to say, more modern look at things. At least modern in the sense of the fact that he's still active, still writing books. His most recent book came out literally this year, and unlike Rothbard, it's not posthumously posted. It's actually just new work by him. So there's tons of stuff there. I'll start off, though, with a question for you, Andrew. If we had to say what his, what are some of the core things that David Friedman contributed that would be separate from just the regular anarcho-capitalism? Like, what makes him a thinker to watch?
The way I think of it is, I kind of think of Friedman as the founder of the consequentialist version of anarcho-capitalism. And by that I mean, well, as opposed to like the Rothbard wing, Rothbard kind of justified anarchism and libertarianism based on it really focused on appeals to morality, with the non-aggression principle and built from there. But whereas Friedman, he talks more about efficiency on a societal level and have efficient law. And he focuses on justice as well, but he kind of mixes the two. And it's that focus on the consequences of law that I think is at least a somewhat unique approach.
Now, like I kind of mentioned, he does have the more recent book out, and I think we can kind of work backwards here. So let's start with some of his new work. What are some key takeaways from the book that he had out? Legal Systems Very Different from Ours. I know you're one of the first people I'd heard about that had gotten a copy of the book, and I'm pretty sure you've devoured it by now, I'm sure. So if you could give me some kind of idea of what he was going for in that book, or some of the more interesting things that he presented through it.
think a major takeaway is that when we talk about anarchism or, an anarchist system, it doesn't all need to be theory. I mean, there have been societies that were, or at least debatably anarchist, or, very, very decentralized state. And there are what he calls embedded legal systems right now, which are like communities of people. Well, he references the Romani, or otherwise known as gypsies, who are kind of, they're in a bunch of different countries, but they make it a point to avoid any interactions with the state they live under. I mean, almost religiously, and so they pretty much rely on their own internal legal system. I think that's one thing I really love about what Friedman does is he takes it much more than just theory. There's actually historical and modern examples we can use, or that we can draw from when talking about your anarchist society.
Yeah, so I mean, if we had to couch him kind of against other philosophers, one of the things that I kind of take away from some of his work, like you said, it's very empirical. It has a very strong base to it. It's not purely just argumentation. It's, okay, hey, look, here's what exists. Here's how things work. Here's ways that it could work. Here's how those things turned out. I would almost say that, Rothbard laid out a bunch of a priori arguments, whereas Friedman really comes in with the a posteriori arguments. He comes in with the experience-based knowledge and really tries to lay that down. And that's one of the things that definitely made me want to discuss him and go through some of his works. Now, flipping it, going a little bit further into the past here, one of his more well-known works, of course, is the book, I think it was, I can't remember the exact year that it came out, The Machinery of Freedom.
I have it here. 1973 was the first edition.
1973 for the first edition?
There are 3 editions, I believe.
Oh. I knew the book existed. I couldn't remember the year or how many editions they had done of it, or if there was any major changes to it, but maybe you can give me a bit more of an example of the book here. I know that it advocates anarcho-capitalism, and it does it from a very, like we've talked about already, a very consequentialist position. And I think, if I'm remembering it correctly, it's been a while since I've read it. It also did it with a lot of utilitarian positions as well. But maybe you can dive into some of the key arguments that he made there a little bit better.
Yeah. Well, I've talked about, he does focus on consequentialism, but he also, he doesn't ignore the moral aspect. He describes himself as an ethical intuitionist in the vein of Michael Huemer. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but in a nutshell, it's kind of taking, basically it's how you feel. And so like, if you think about, shooting an innocent person or a peaceful person, we all kind of feel that's wrong. So, he's perfectly fine to start with at that, but then he kind of uses efficiency argument to fine tune that, because once you get into the nuances of law, things aren't nearly as obvious. It's like, when exactly is murder manslaughter, or what should be the punishment, that type of thing. So he uses the consequences of the law to fine tune his intuitions. And so from there, he builds up a case for anarchism.
Now, I've heard over time, quite a few people kind of not necessarily disregard his work. I know that there's a lot of people who support, obviously they support anarcho-capitalism, but they don't seem to consider or be particularly invested in those types of empirical cases. They think that a pure logic or a pure reason type of argumentation can prove their case, but by doing that, or by having that stance, they don't really take into consideration the purposes behind some of these consequentialist arguments. So if we're talking to someone who's outside of the libertarian sphere. So someone who doesn't look at everything in the concepts of everything as a property right or any of the other kind of terminology that gets thrown around heavily in libertarianism or libertarian circles, at least. If we're talking to a normal person outside of these circles, where does David Friedman's angle come in helping us explain our stances to them and potentially bring them over to understanding our view and our approach towards absolute liberty?
I think the consequentialist arguments are really powerful in that regard. You know, people care about justice, but they really care about what's going to happen. You can tell someone, if you can say taxation is theft, and what's the most common reply? It's that, yeah, but how will we build the roads? And so obviously that's a leap right into consequentialism. And so those arguments need to be addressed. It seems like a lot of libertarians' reply to that objection is, well, who cares? I mean, it's theft. And in a way, maybe they're right, but a lot of people, that doesn't do anything for them.
Yeah, it's one of those, you're right, sure, but it doesn't answer the question. It's kind of a completely unrelated answer almost. Like, is taxation theft? Yeah, we can look at it as theft, or we could call it extortion if you want to get really technical. Sure. But then we get into explaining that to someone who says, well, in my eyes, ends justify means. Now what? And then you have to kind of go into that consequentialist argument. Otherwise, you're just kind of throwing, at least the way that I've seen it unfold several times, you're just kind of throwing opinion at opinion. It's not even argument at argument or point at point. You're throwing a feeling at a feeling or a worldview at a worldview without any real weight to it until we start to ground it down and bring in some of that empirical side, some of that consequentialist side.
And I think if you press pretty much anyone hard enough, no one is completely 100% deontological based. There probably is some scenario you could come up with where someone would think theft is okay or breaking into a house is okay. You could be maybe walking in the you could be in a winter storm and in the woods and lost, and there's a cabin and no one's there. And in that instance, it might not be too bad to break in, but technically you're trespassing, So I think the moral prohibitions on breaking property or infringing on property rights only go so far.
Mm-hmm. And you see, this is something I find gets really ignored in a lot of libertarian debate, at least in my experience, is that there's a difference between the argument of, what should be the legalities of an anarchist society or of a minarchist society or anything like that, or just a libertarian society in general, versus what ethical rules there should be or what moral systems or moral ideologies should become hopefully prevalent inside of a society. And I find that outside of, the kind of more consequentialist arguments, so in the realm of just pure deontological arguments, I find that they don't make the distinction, because as soon as they do, they have to acknowledge real world scenarios. They have to put the idea into a set field, in which case now there can be empirical evidence. Now there can be experimentation. Now there can be a review of some of the history of things that have happened, or when similar situations have happened with those types of ideas in play, and how they've turned out for better or for worse. And of course, even people that like pure argumentatives, they like pure, a priori arguments. As soon as they find anything that shows evidence to their favor, they're going to immediately jump on using it to support their cause.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned there definitely is a difference between something being illegal, either in under a state or in a stateless society, and then also making the decision to break that rule or law just because in that instance it might be moral.
Yeah, and I think it's funny because again, libertarians consider themselves, the principled position, because the amount of things that have to be not shrugged off. That seems like the wrong phrasing. And I know how important phrasing is, after some of the back and forths we've had on things like self-ownership and the like. Phrasing is a very important thing, but I find that it irks me. So sorry if I'm losing my words here a little bit. It irks me a little bit, because I find that it's such an important case-making distinction. And it's something that, even if you talk about philosophers that are consequentialists, like David Friedman, if you talk about people who are almost purely a priori, if you go into, say Mises or some of Rothbard's work, or any of those other quote unquote big thinkers in the libertarian movement, almost all of them address things in very specific areas. And they say, this might be purely morally wrong or morally right. But legality should be different. Or they might say it's going to be just legally right or legally wrong in this kind of scenario. However, morality says it could be the other way. Not sure how to reconcile that. But the consequentialist argument at least attempts, doesn't always succeed. I think David Friedman does a really good job on it, though. Works towards fixing that split. Because once it's grounded in the real world, all of these factors come into play.
I think, a big part of Friedman's work is focusing on how a potential anarchist society would produce good law. It's not necessarily that, because some arguments against the state are just that it's immoral, it's evil. But it's his whole, I don't know, I guess worldview is just based on crafting law that's tends to be just or will tend to be efficient. So he acknowledges it's not going to be perfect. Just thinks that it'll be better than most states.
Now, I guess I'll ask you another question here then, because he did mention, he thinks that he couches things in the terminologies of, it'll tend to be, it's more likely to be, it's preferable. If there was another thinker whose works could be combined with Friedman's to try to really cement home some of the stuff that he's saying, whose works do you think that would be if there is someone like that?
Well, I can't think of anyone in the kind of what you were talking about from an economic perspective, but I mentioned Michael Huemer earlier, and that he is who comes to mind. But he is based, his arguments are, he writes a lot about ethical intuitionism, and that, I think they work well together, because Friedman does rely on that ultimately.
Okay, so that would be so that one's a different angle that we could go through to try to tie those things off a little bit better. And it really kind of shows the depth of the work when you need to get a really good understanding of a certain thinker. You have to go and read other thinkers as well to kind of build that base up, which is another thing that's good with Friedman here, is because you don't need to have a massive backdrop of knowledge to dive into his works. It helps though, and it unlocks. I want to say unlock again, bad term, but it unlocks different layers to his argumentation. It makes it a lot more solid, but it's also something that you can dive into and start to understand right from the get-go. Very good on the, I can say this as on the editing side, very good just as a writer as well. One other thing I wanted to touch on here, before we started recording, you'd made mention of a particular essay. And I think that it might be something really interesting for the audience to hear a bit more about. So did you want to elaborate on the essay and go through some of that?
Yeah, I think it's a pretty important contribution. It's called a positive account of rights. It's a perspective on rights, property rights, that is neither from a legal perspective or a normative or moral perspective. So it's not observing rights as states define them, or even as a stateless legal system would define them, or whether they're good. But so it's kind of just, well, the first part is based on how rights basically could arise in a Hobbesian state of nature type arrangement, where there's no institutions, no state, and just, a few people. Like, I think he starts with the example is it's just two people living on an island, and just based on their self-interest, no moral qualms against aggression and like I said, no state overseeing them. He argues that they would tend to create property rights or de facto property rights. And he references a game theory concept called Schelling points, which is, from what I understand, it's just the idea that when two random people meet, they can't really communicate or they don't trust each other, they still will tend to agree on things that stand out to them. So it's like the two people on an island, if they want to get along at all, they want to, stick to a certain patch of land. An obvious dividing line might be like a river that runs through the island, and then so maybe the land that's on one side would be one person's, and land on the other side of the river is the other person's. And the thing is, if they didn't agree to that, then maybe there's no other obvious dividing line, and so then that would guarantee that they would fight. And then once that is established, each party has an incentive, again, from a self-interest perspective, to defend that, maybe even to the death, because if one person tries to move the line, try to take over more land, the other, that river is already an established Schelling point or a precedent, and once that's gone, then all of a sudden there's no new place there's no reason to say the one person shouldn't take over the whole island and be king, So the even if one person is weaker or is stronger than the other, the weaker person still an incentive to protect even a seemingly arbitrary line, just because if he knows that if he doesn't, he'll lose more and more rights.
That's a very interesting take. I really like that too. I know a little while back when I went through the Rothbardian example of the Caruso scenario, where it's just two people on an island or a single person on an island, and they start developing these things. That particular aspect of a stronger or weaker force wasn't really addressed. So I really like that Friedman acknowledged that that's a thing, and that people can be aggressive simply because they can be greedy. That's something that I find gets ignored a lot in deontological arguments. They ignore some of the negative behaviors, and they look at it more of an afterthought rather than addressing the fact that people are not purely rational agents with perfect reason. People are not devoid of emotion outside of baseline desires, that they're okay getting just what they need and then stopping there. So it's good to see. It's good to see that the other aspects of human nature are being addressed while still staying in a grounded scenario or a potential scenario, and working out what it would look like from there.
Yeah,
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, he refers to these. He calls them commitment strategies, and it's almost. I think most people have this intuition that they have. If they get the idea that they have a right to something, that they'll defend it. If you're if your neighbor decides to start dumping trash in your lawn, the cost might not be. It could be very little, maybe it's just a little bit, but most people will spend quite a few more resources making sure that doesn't happen than even what it costs to them. It seems like we're wired to defend what we think is ours, even if it's not, but what we claim, it seems like we're wired to defend it at all costs. And yeah, well, another example he references in modern day is it's between states, which kind of function in a sense, it's a form of anarchism. Between nation states, there's not necessarily a higher sovereign. But he references the Falklands War of 1982, in which the Falkland Islands were claimed by Great Britain as well as Argentina, or I think Great Britain controlled them, and then Argentina decided to take them, invaded the islands, and they're just some couple small islands. But Great Britain responded with sending a significant force to take them back, and really doesn't make much sense to spend so many resources taking them, because the islands, I mean, they weren't worth much, and they can't have been providing much in tax revenue. But the point was that the state of Great Britain and the people running the state thought of those islands as their property, so they were willing to, it didn't really matter the cost. They were just willing to defend it. And consequentially, you can see that it made sense, because if they would have just let Argentina take the islands, their colonies, other neighboring countries to other Great Britain colonies would have gotten the idea that, well, maybe these colonies are up for grabs. And then all of a sudden, the cost would have been substantial to Great Britain.
Because at the worst case, that would set up the precedent that you can take from this person. And sometimes it's not a matter of what you're defending. It's a matter of sending the message that what you have will be defended.
Right, I think that's the exact concept. And that works even better with individuals, I think.
Definitely. Now, I guess the last thing that I'll ask you here when it comes to Friedman would be, when it comes to Friedman's arguments or some of the cases that he puts forward, what would you say is the biggest hole in his work? Like, is there any major errors or argumentative holes or potential weak spots that you see in his work? And if you have any suggestions on how to correct them, what do you think those would be?
He sticks to a particular idea of how he imagines a future stateless society could function, with rights enforcement agencies, people contracting for security and arbitration. And, I like the ideas, and it's certainly helpful to have a framework, especially when explaining how it could work. But I guess I would probably like to see maybe him explore other frameworks, because the historical societies he's talked about, the alternative legal systems, they've varied a fair amount. They seem to have some of the same core tenets, but it would be, I would just like him to, because I do think an anarchist society could, especially if it's a large region, it's going to vary considerably from place to place. And so I would like to see him explore other types of systems.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, it's interesting you mentioned that, considering that his most recent book was Legal Systems Very Different from Ours. You think that would, or at least hopefully, because, he's still writing and all that, would spark an exploration to how some of those other regions might actually develop, or some of the concepts that they might come up with in their own version of anarchy that might be a little different from the one that he's presented as standard case for anarchy. I would.
Right. He definitely has explored varying systems historically. It's just in a future societies, he definitely tends to stick with one framework, which, I can understand that it makes it easier.
Yeah, it's easier to try to pitch one hypothetical future than it is to try to pitch the fact that there could be thousands of hypothetical futures, all of which could end up looking completely different from each other, but all still hold the same principles. It's kind of hard to frame that in an argument that lets people wrap their heads around it until they've at least agreed with one. I guess what we'll do then is, just for the sake of the time that we have on here, we'll just get everything wrapped up. Andrew, again, I definitely want to thank you for coming on the show here. So other than the Principled Libertarian Facebook page, was there anything that you wanted to plug or mention while we're on the episode here?
I do have a public profile on Facebook, Andrew Kern, but also the Principled Libertarian website, which is principledlibertarian.com, where that's pretty much all the articles I think are published there that I've written are published there, and then a few others from other writers as well.
Yeah, definitely a great website to check out. There's been some works on there that have been absolutely mind-blowing, and we've actually, we've worked with Andrew in the past to be able to, be allowed to publish those over to Think Liberty, just because some of the things that he's explained and the depth that he's explained it in has made it so that we can really push certain concepts, especially I really liked both your minarchists and anarchists being on the same road article that you had a little while back, as well as the social contract series that he did. We did cross-host those on Think Liberty. However, you can read them natively, and I do suggest reading them natively over at the Principled Libertarian website there. So with all that said, thank you again very much for being on the show. As I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, you can follow us on all forms of social media. You can listen to our podcasts wherever you get your podcasts. And of course, if you liked what you heard and you'd like to hear more, I'll see you again next week.